dear students. Today we will discuss about William Wordsworth on poetry, on the language of poetry from your syllabus, which is taken from his preface to the lyrical ballads. As you know that his lyrical ballads, which was published earlier, that didn't have the preface, but in the second edition only, which was published in 1801, he added the preface. And the purpose of adding this preface, make his readers know about his concept of poetry and why he composed such poetry. Beginning of period, the 19th century, which is still continuing with the Romanticism or the Romantic revival that began in the last part of 18th century. And Wordsworth being one of the significant poet of this period, because he was a great advocate of nature and its different facets. Nature to him, in his own words, was the nurse, the teacher, the friend, the philosopher, and everything. So, in his poetry, he charted a completely different way than the earlier romantic poets or the earlier poets who dealt with nature. Even among his contemporaries, poets like Keats, Shelley, Byron, and most significantly, Keats and Shelley, who dealt with nature in significant manner, or even Coleridge, from them Wordsworth differed. And in his preface, he wants to discuss particularly about the poetic manifesto, and most significantly he talks about the theme of his poetry, the diction of his poetry, the feelings or emotion of his poetry, and definition of poetry, as well as the language. Excuse me. So he begins his essay or the preface by talking about the determination of exact import of the promise which by the act of writing in verse an author in the present day makes to his reader. That means what an author promises to his reader in his contemporary period. What is that promise? So he is telling that in my poetry, the principal object then which I proposed to myself in these poems was to make the incidents of common life interesting by tracing in them truly, though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of our nature. So it is very clear from his declaration, which is there in your book, page 131, that his primary proposal in these poems was to represent the primary laws of nature. So he elaborates that the primary object of him in representing the nature is to bring out the experience of man, where it is the association between man and nature in a state of excitement. It is not an ordinary relationship, it is not a very uh, dull relationship, but it is of excitement. So he elaborates, low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that situation the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity. So, for his purpose of representing man-nature relationship with all its excitement, he has selected the low and rustic. So, the theme or the life that he represents in his poems, they are taken from low and rustic life. Why? Because he is telling that in this state of life, we find the essential passions of the heart. That means the natural response of the heart, which is finding a better soil, means it is finding a better response from nature, or it is responding in a very spontaneous or natural manner to nature. Therefore, he has selected the low and rustic life. Then he is explaining further that they can attain their maturity or less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. And why he has selected this life? Not only because they communicate with nature in very unrestricted manner, but also they do not have any elaborate or embellished language. Their language is very simple, very plain, and emphatic. So this emphatic language, why the language is emphatic? Because the language is simple. There is the simple rudimentary emotions. And he is telling that life germinates from those elementary feelings, and from the necessary character of rural occupations are more easily comprehended and are more durable. And lastly, because in that situation the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So, in this condition of life, what we find that the character of rural occupation, the people in the rural, they're occupied with agriculture, animal husbandry, fishing, etc., which are closely related with nature and the vagaries of nature. So, the beautiful forms of nature, the movements of nature, the changes in the nature are all visible in these rustic lives. And as a result, representing these rustic lives is of paramount importance to Wordsworth as a nature poet. In page 132, in the first paragraph, you look. Accordingly, such a language arising out of repeated experience and regular feelings is a more permanent and a far more philosophical language than that which is frequently substituted for it by poets. So, he is explaining that why he had chosen the plain, simple, and emphatic language. He is telling that in this language, what we find? The repeated experience and regular feelings. For example, suppose someone has felt the bright sunshine or the heat of the sunshine, and how we express that heat of the sunshine on our body or below our feet when we are walking on the naked feet, that it is too hot. So this language is not substituted, this language is not manipulated, this language has not undergone any further changes in a rustic life, in a simple life. Simple people in simple expression repeat the same language under the same experience or the small variation of those experiences. A simple person doesn't know the expression of complexity. Therefore, the language is having repeated experience and regular feelings, and therefore it has a permanent value. The moment we are uttering a sentence of exclamation, wow, how beautiful it looks. So it never gives a different meaning. It gives only that meaning that somewhere we are overwhelmed by some beauty. Therefore, he is telling when the meaning attached to this simple language is permanent, it is philosophical. Because philosophy means the condensation of a language. Suppose the philosophy says man is mortal. So, what is that mortality? The mortality can be of 100 types, 1000 types. People die in different circumstances due to different causes, but all are coming under one category, that is mortality. So, that is philosophical. So, simple language, as it doesn't have any variation, so it is philosophical. So, Wordsworth is arguing that a simple more philosophical significance. Therefore, he is making a choice of it in his poetry. So, he is declaring that in his poetry the reader should not search for embellishment of language, decoration of language. Then, in page 133, he is giving half of his definition of poetry. He is telling for all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But though this be true, poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on any variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility. So, he is defining what is good poetry by telling that it is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So, what is a powerful feeling? As we have just discussed about the language, the simple language is powerful, permanent, philosophical. Similarly, the powerful feeling is the simple emotion, the basic emotion of man. Therefore, he is telling all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. When powerful feelings are overflowing in a spontaneous manner, it is not a deliberate manner. When spontaneously the powerful feelings are coming to a mind, and not only coming to the mind, overflowing, that means overwhelming. We are overwhelmed by those feelings. Then only good poetry will be possible. Elaborating that in this long paragraph, that how powerful feelings or the basic feelings of man that overwhelms when it comes in contact with the basic nature. The nature outside, the capital N, that overwhelms man, or the nature within, the small n, by its enormity, by its shape, by its size, its color, its sprightfulness, its vividity, etc. So he is telling in the last sentence of that paragraph in page 134. But speaking in less general language, it is to follow the fluxes and refluxes of the mind when agitated by the great and simple affections of our nature. So, the powerful feelings in the state of spontaneous overflow cannot only guarantee good poetry. It is the beginning of creating good poetry. But he is telling that it must follow fluxes and refluxes of the mind when agitated by the great and simple affections of our nature. When our mind is affected greatly by nature, when our mind is spontaneously in an overflow, the language must go through the fluxes and refluxes of the mind, how the mind is changing from one state to another, from one excitement to another. It is narration of the mind of a child. For example, a child looks at a particular toy, gets excited, then he discovers another big toy, he gets further excited, but at that moment he is not dismissive of the first toy. So similar is the condition of the mind of a poet when he is going to compose great poetry. His mind must go from fluxes to refluxes, and those languages, those expressions must be a part of the poetry. Then he is talking about the characters within his poetry. That who are the characters that inhabit his poetry. So he is telling in the next paragraph that characters of which the elements are simple, belonging rather to nature than to manners. That means in his poetry, he has chosen those characters who are not characters of manners. That means they are not belonging to urban civilization or the culture of gentlemen, where mannerism is dominating over the basic nature, the basic emotion. So his characters are also rustic. They are also taken from the simpler mind, simpler reflexes of emotion without the influence of manners. And we know that he has written Lucy poems. He has written the poems where we find the characters are like the shepherds and others. So it is basically the simple characters which populate his poetry. Then he is talking about the structure of the poem in page 137, second paragraph. If in a poem there should be found a series of lines or even a single line in which the language, though naturally arranged and according to the strict laws of meter, doesn't differ from that approach, there is a numerous class of critics who, when they stumble upon these prosaisms, as they call them, imagine that they have made a notable discovery and exult over the poet as over a man ignorant of his own profession. He is very critical of those critics who generally criticize poets, those poets in whose writing they do not find any difference from expression or the language structure different from the prose structure. He is telling that those those critics, they take this chance to criticize the poet. But I am not going to submit to these critics in this manner. That means he is telling that simple language can either be prosaic or poetic. So if somebody thinks, or if any critic thinks that his poetic creations are so simple that they look prosaic, so he is telling that simple language is always poetic. It may be arranged in prose, it may be arranged in poetic stanzaic form, but they are always poetic. Why? Because already the explanation he has given earlier. Because such type of language are philosophical, such type of language are permanent in meaning, such type of language are emphatic. In page 138, he is talking about the difference between prose and metrical composition. Again, he is telling that is there, then it will be asked, no essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition? I answer that there neither is nor can be any essential difference. So you remember for such questions that according to Wordsworth, there cannot be any difference between language of prose and poetry. And he is talking about the comparison between poetry and painting. We are fond of tracing the resemblance between poetry and painting, and accordingly we call them sisters. But where shall we find bonds of connection sufficiently strict to typify the affinity betwixt metrical and prose composition? So he is telling between the poetry and painting, there are certain similarities and there are also differences. They both speak by to the same same organs. The bodies in which both of them are clothed may be said to be of the same substance. Their affections are kindred and almost identical, not necessarily differing even in degree. Poetry sets no with natural human. She boasts of that distinguishes her vital juices from those of prose. So he is telling that poetry and painting, they are what we find that both are appealing to the same emotion of man, but they appeal to the same emotion of man with different mediums. And then in page 139 he is telling that poetic diction, arbitrary and subject to infinite caprices, upon which no calculation whatever can be made. Again, he is talking about the poetic language as also the critics. He is telling that poetic language is always arbitrary. We can't decide what it should be. It is not pre-decided. It is not grammatical. It is arbitrary. Why? Because the poet's mind is overflowing with powerful emotions. So it is arbitrary. Therefore, subject to infinite caprices. Means any number of changes, any number of twists, any number of innovations upon which no calculation whatever can be made. So no calculation can be made that how the poet should compose about a particular subject. If it is a nature poetry, what sort of language the poet should use, we can't say. It is upon the poet at that particular moment of excitement or inspiration. Then in the next paragraph, he is telling a very small part of the pleasure given by poetry depends upon the meter, and it is injudicious to write in meter unless it be accompanied with the other artificial distinctions of style, with which meter is usually accompanied. He is telling that one sort of pleasure or additional pleasure can also be derived from the metrical stanza or the metrical arrangement of poetry. But we should not use the meter unless it is accompanied with other artificial arrangements. That means when the poet is going to follow the meter, the poet has to go by certain length of lines, because he has to count the foot, he has to go for the stress on stress, because English metrical system is having several distinct structures. So in that case, what happens? It hinders to some extent the romantic expression, which is free flowing, which is unhindered. Therefore, he is telling, if any poet chooses to follow the metrical format, he must have to go by certain artificial manipulation of language. Otherwise, the meter cannot be adopted in poetry. Then in page 140, he is talking about subject written upon more humble subjects and in a more naked and simple style than what I have aimed at, which poems have continued to give pleasure from generation to generation. Now, if nakedness and simplicity be a defect, the fact here mentioned affords a strong presumption that poems somewhat less naked and simple are capable of affording pleasure. He is criticizing his detractors who accused him as using very naked and simple style, because some of the contemporary critics accused him that he is not a poet, he is not following the poetics. He is telling that from the beginning, great poets are also using naked and simple style, which is continuing from generation to generation and giving pleasure. So if nakedness and simplicity be a defect, if it is a defect now, so what can be done? He is telling, in my poems, which are somewhat less, which are naked and simple, if they be compared with other poetry, which are less naked and simple, can it be found that my poems are not affording pleasure equal to those poems? Are they less in providing pleasure? Then in the next paragraph, he is talking about the object of poetry or why poetry. He is telling, the end of poetry is to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure. Already we have come from Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus. Everyone is talking about pleasure. Pleasure being one of the most important aspect of poetry. So again, Wordsworth is emphasizing on that by telling, the end of poetry or the purpose of poetry is to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure. He is adding something more to pleasure. He is telling the pleasure must be not ordinary pleasure. You cannot simply say ha ha ha, he he. It should be ha ha ha. When man is not in control of his emotion, overbalance of pleasure, and that too with company of excitement in coexistence. Man must be excited. After reading a poem, man must be excited, and man must not be in control of his pleasure. That should be the end of poetry. So he is going a step more than the classical concept of pleasure. Then in page 141, he is coming to the duty of the poet. He is telling, it would have been my duty to develop the various causes upon which the pleasure received from metrical language depends. Among the chief of these causes is to be reckoned a principle which must be well known to those who have made any of the arts the object of accurate reflection. I mean the pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. So he is telling that the duty of the poet, or his own duty, is to develop the various causes upon which the pleasure received from metrical language depends. That means, if we want to derive the pleasure from metrical system used in poetry, then we have to develop various causes. But when we do not exactly follow the metrical system, it is only the excitement, it is only the overflow of powerful emotions that can provide the pleasure. So he is telling, I mean the pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. But what is the main pleasure in poetry? The main pleasure in poetry is when the mind is deriving the pleasure in perceiving similitude in dissimilitude. Similitude means similarity, dissimilitude means dissimilarity. The poet is looking at a river. The river is flowing, and it is flowing in a very tortuous manner, and the poet is comparing the river as a snake, or maybe the flow of life. So what happens? The river cannot be a snake, the river cannot be the flow of life. So within this dissimilarity, the poet is giving a perception of similarity. So we ordinary people, we suddenly wake up to that and we say, oh yes, yes, that's true. We didn't realize. The poet is looking at a tree, but the poet is comparing the tree with the figure of his beloved. So they are dissimilar, but the poet is able to find the similarity between the two. So what is happening? We are perceiving the same thing through poetry, the imagination of the poet in our mind. So that is the basic concept of pleasure. And besides that pleasure, other pleasures can be derived either from the meter, arrangement of the meter, or the embellishment of the language by figures of speech. And he is telling that all these depends on our taste and our moral feelings. So this mental perception, it is coming from our own taste, means our culture, our morality. A person may be looking at a deer and is happy because he thinks that the deer is so lovely and he can kill it and consume its meat. So that is a pleasure. The moment he looks at a deer, he feels very very pleased. Another fellow may be looking at the beauty of the deer and he cannot imagine any harm to the deer. So his pleasure will come from that. So the moralities are different, the tastes are different. So in poetry also, it affects. Our derivation of pleasure also depends on our morality. How we look at nature, how we look at the things that the poet is pointing at. Then in page 142, he is coming to the second part of his poetic definition. In the early part, he said that what is poetry? Poetry, he said that it is a powerful emotion, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But now he is telling it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. That only powerful feelings overflowing spontaneously cannot create good poetry. Suppose you have gone to visit a nice place, you saw beautiful nature, the sun is setting, it looks overwhelmingly pleasant to you, you become happy, and you will say, Sir, I am going to compose a poem now, and it will be a good poem. Never. Because that moment you are excited, your language may not do justice to what you feel. So when you come back, you recollect those experiences in tranquility, in silence, when you are detached from that particular scene, from that particular time, then only you can produce good poetry. So in this way, what is happening? Wordsworth's poetic definition is having two parts. First is, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The second part is recollected in tranquility. Means the first part is highly subjective when the poet is involved, indulged. His mind is overflowing with powerful emotions. But the second part is objective. When those powerful emotions are again recollected in tranquility, you have been sitting silent and you are thinking about that, still you are feeling the excitement. But this time, the excitement has been defined in a proper sense. So that is the formula for good poetry according to Wordsworth. Then finally, he is telling in the last, an accurate taste in poetry and in all other arts, as Sir Joshua Reynolds has observed, is an acquired talent which can only be produced by thought and a long continued intercourse with the best models of composition. You can be a good poet by your powerful emotion, by your recollection in tranquility. But one thing he is telling, you can't be a great poet, you can't be a good poet overnight. You must have the taste of going through best models of composition. That means you must be reading lots of good poetry. You must acquire the talent of composing poetry by making practice. Overnight you cannot be a poet. You may feel, yes sir, Wordsworth has given us the formula, so I'll go to some place, I'll be overexcited, I will come back home, I'll be sitting all alone, I'll compose poetry and I'll be like Wordsworth. Never. You have to go through good poetry. You have to develop a taste for poetry. Then you have to make practice of composing poetry. Then only all your emotions and your feelings, powerful feelings, can help you in producing good poetry.